In a quiet corner of Las Vegas, a shocking and twisted story unfolded that no one saw coming. A respected police officer, sworn to protect and serve, found himself entangled in a deadly affair with a young neighbor, a relationship that would ultimately end in betrayal, violence, and murder. In the heart of Las Vegas, where the lights never seem to dim and the desert heat bakes everything in sight, a tragic and twisted tale unfolded. The story began in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood just outside the bustling Strip, where the lives of seemingly ordinary people were about to collide in a way no one could have predicted. It all began in the summer of 2023, when Officer Mark Williams, a well-known figure in the local police force, moved into a modest home on East Flamingo Road. Mark was a cop who prided himself on his service, or at least, that's how he wanted people to see him. In reality, there was more to his persona than met the eye. Beneath the uniform and the badge, Mark held deep-rooted prejudices, ones that he tried to suppress, but couldn't completely ignore. These were the kinds of feelings that he justified with misguided beliefs, ones that had been shaped over the years by his upbringing, the circles he ran in, and the power he wielded as an officer of the law. His views were known among his colleagues, though they were never spoken out loud, too afraid of repercussions from the system they all operated within. It was one afternoon in late June when Mark first met Sarah Johnson, a young black woman in her 20s who had recently moved in next door. She was kind, soft-spoken, and had dreams of making it big in the entertainment industry. She had a job as a waitress at one of the Strip's many upscale hotels, working long hours and saving every penny for her future. To Sarah, moving to Las Vegas had been a fresh start, away from the troubles she had left behind in her small town. She wanted a life filled with opportunities, a life where she could rise above the stereotypes that had often been imposed on her. At first, their interactions were simple, polite exchanges between neighbors. Mark had greeted her one evening when he noticed her struggling to carry heavy bags up the stairs to her apartment. He had offered to help, and from that point forward, they would occasionally talk in passing, small talk about the weather, the neighborhood, or her job. However, over the weeks that followed, Mark found himself drawn to Sarah. He admired her beauty, her independence, and perhaps most of all, her strength. Something about her intrigued him, though he would never admit it to anyone. Sarah, for her part, felt a strange sense of relief when Mark was around. He was older, more experienced, and seemed protective in a way that was reassuring. He had a charm that she couldn't deny. Though she had never been interested in older men before, there was something about Mark's presence that made her feel safe. As the weeks wore on, their brief exchanges turned into longer conversations, and Mark began to open up to her in ways he never had before. He spoke of his career, his frustrations with the police force, and how difficult it had been for him to settle into his new life. Sarah, ever the listener, offered him the comfort he sought, despite not fully knowing the man behind the uniform. It wasn't long before their connection deepened. Mark began visiting her apartment more frequently, at first under the guise of checking in on her as a concerned neighbor, but over time, his visits grew more personal. He would bring her gifts, flowers, wine, expensive chocolates, and they would talk for hours. Their conversations became more intimate, and soon, their bond was unmistakable. Mark found himself caught between the quiet racist prejudices he had buried deep inside and the growing attraction he felt for Sarah. He knew it wasn't right. He knew he should have kept his distance, but the temptation was too strong. In moments of weakness, he convinced himself that she was different, that she wasn't like the others. For Sarah, the situation was more complicated. She had heard rumors about Mark before, about his past, about how he was known for his strict, almost ruthless enforcement of the law. Yet when she was with him, she didn't see the cop. She saw a man who made her feel seen, heard, and important. She ignored the red flags that should have been warning signs. She saw what she wanted to see. A man who was kind and protective. Someone who could offer her a life she never thought possible. She didn't realize that the man who was showing her kindness was also someone who had buried anger within him, someone whose views on race were as toxic as they were hidden. As the summer of 2023 wore on, Mark's obsession with Sarah grew. What had started as an innocent flirtation became something darker, something more dangerous. His visits became more frequent, more intense. He wanted to be a part of her life, but at the same time he couldn't escape the parts of him that resented her for being different from him, for challenging his views. It wasn't long before their friendship blurred into something neither of them was prepared for. The lines between affection and control began to fade, and with it, the mask Mark had so carefully constructed began to crack. Sarah, for her part, had mixed feelings. She started to feel uncomfortable with the increasing frequency of his visits, but there was a part of her that couldn't let go. She wanted the relationship to work. She was conflicted, torn between the man who seemed to care for her and the mounting unease she felt in the pit of her stomach. At times she questioned the wisdom of continuing to see him. But the pull was strong. She didn't want to let go of the only person who had made her feel important in a long time. As she wrestled with her emotions, little did she know, things were about to take a deadly turn. One evening in late August, a confrontation took place between the two of them that would change everything. The details of that night would never fully come to light, but what was clear was that the simmering tension between Mark and Sarah had reached its breaking point. What started as an argument over something trivial escalated into violence. Fueled by jealousy, anger, and a sense of powerlessness, Mark lashed out in a way that would forever scar both of their lives. By the time the police arrived at the scene, it was too late. Sarah's body was found in her apartment, lifeless and battered. The once charming officer had turned into something far more monstrous, his actions driven by a cocktail of emotions he could no longer contain. What had begun as a forbidden affair had transformed into a brutal act of violence, and the consequences would echo throughout the community for years to come. The case quickly made headlines across Las Vegas. As the investigation unfolded, the darker details of Mark's personal life began to surface. His hidden prejudices, his feelings of entitlement, and his inability to separate power from control were laid bare for all to see. What had seemed like a simple affair had turned into something much more sinister, an unraveling of a man who thought he could keep his demons hidden, but who was ultimately undone by them. The weeks that followed the night of Sarah Johnson's tragic death brought no peace for the community, nor for the people closest to the case. As the investigation into Officer Mark Williams' actions unfolded, the residents of East Flamingo Road were stunned by what they were learning. The man who had seemed like an upstanding officer, the one who had protected and served, now stood at the center of a dark narrative that was difficult to comprehend. At first, the police were hesitant to draw immediate conclusions. Officer Williams had been in the force for over a decade, a veteran of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, and they wanted to handle the case with the professionalism expected of those in law enforcement. However, as more details emerged, it became clear that what had been presented as a simple tragedy was, in fact, the result of years of unspoken tension, racial prejudices, and an emotional storm that had finally exploded. In the days after Sarah's death, the police learned more about the victim's troubled past, details that had remained largely unknown to those around her. Sarah had been living in Las Vegas for just under 2 years, trying to find her place in a world that often seemed intent on keeping her down. She had a complicated history with men, and her relationships had been marked by abusive patterns that she had struggled to break free from. Yet, despite these hurdles, she had kept her head above water, never letting the hardship of her past define her. Her relationship with Mark had started as a seemingly innocent but sweet connection born out of mutual need, but it quickly became something far more entangled. The fact that Mark was an officer, someone who had considerable power in the neighborhood, only added to the intensity of their bond. What Sarah saw as kindness, protection, and a way to feel safe in a city she was still learning to navigate, Mark saw as control. He started to manipulate her, getting into her head, using his position to sway her emotions. But even more troubling was the fact that his racist views, ones that had remained largely out of sight, began to surface as their relationship developed. Detectives on the case soon uncovered a disturbing thing in Mark's behavior. He had a history of inappropriate comments, casual racism that he never seemed to realize was damaging. Neighbors recalled overhearing him making dismissive remarks about black people, particularly when he didn't think anyone was listening. It became evident that while Mark had tried to present himself as a well-meaning, law-abiding citizen, there was an uglier side to his character that he had kept hidden. His relationship with Sarah was more than just an illicit affair. It was a manifestation of his toxic need to dominate, control, and belittle. As investigators sifted through Sarah's personal belongings and phone records, they discovered evidence of threats. She had received texts from Mark that were chilling, though subtle enough to avoid immediate suspicion. They were the kind of texts that appeared benign at first, but, when viewed in hindsight, revealed a possessiveness that bordered on obsession. Sarah had tried to distance herself from Mark in the weeks leading up to her death, but she hadn't succeeded. The final message she received from him, just hours before the incident, was a demand that she meet him in her apartment. He told her that they needed to talk, that she owed him an explanation for her recent coldness. As the investigation continued, the more Mark's behavior started to unravel. He was taken into custody, though his arrest was not as swift as many had hoped. There was a tense standoff between the authorities, who had enough evidence to charge him with homicide, and the police union, which immediately went on the defensive. Mark's colleagues were quick to rally behind him, some claiming that his actions had been out of character, while others remained silent, unwilling to tarnish the reputation of one of their own. Despite the delay, the truth slowly came to light. During his time in custody, Mark's demeanor shifted. Initially, he denied any wrongdoing, sticking to his claim that the death had been an accident, a tragic and unforeseen series of events. However, as the days wore on and the pressure mounted, his defenses began to crack. The stress of the investigation, combined with his deteriorating mental state, led him to make an unexpected confession to one of the detectives. A confession that would change everything. Mark admitted that he had been harboring deep, unresolved feelings for Sarah. Feelings that had turned into an unhealthy obsession. His jealousy had consumed him when he saw her distancing herself, when he saw her trying to break free from the emotional grip he had placed on her. He confessed that he had struck her during a heated argument, his rage taking over in a moment of blind fury. The altercation, which had started with words, escalated when he pushed her and she fell. Mark, unable to control his mounting frustration and hatred, continued to strike her until she no longer moved. In that moment, he said, he didn't see her as the woman he once cared about. He saw her as a threat, a woman who had taken something from him, a sense of control, of dominance. He had to teach her a lesson. The confession was chilling. It revealed not only Mark's capacity for violence, but also his deep-seated racial resentment. He had been so consumed by his need to control Sarah that he failed to see the human being standing before him, choosing instead to act on his darkest impulses. But perhaps even more disturbing was the fact that Mark had made no attempt to cover up his crime. He had left Sarah's body in her apartment, as though he had no fear of the consequences. His arrogance, his sense of invulnerability, had led him to believe that his badge would protect him from justice. As Mark's trial approached, the community was left in a state of shock. Those who had once admired him for his service, who had seen him as a pillar of the community, now had to reckon with the horrific truth about the man they had trusted. The case became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power, of how deep-seated prejudices can manifest in the most unexpected ways. It was a reminder that the face of evil often wears a mask of normalcy, that the line between good and bad is not always as clear as it appears. Sarah's family, meanwhile, struggled to make sense of the loss. Her mother, who had tried to reach out to her daughter in the final months of her life, was consumed by guilt and sorrow. Her friends, who had known Sarah to be kind and full of life, couldn't reconcile the woman they had known with the tragic end she had suffered. Mark's actions had shattered their world, leaving behind only the question of why someone who had sworn to protect could commit such an unforgivable act. In the end, the trial would serve as a reminder of the complexities of power, race, and human behavior. But for those who had known Sarah, and for those who had witnessed the shocking downfall of Officer Mark Williams, there would be no simple answers. Only the painful reality that sometimes the darkness we hide inside is more dangerous than we could ever imagine. Just when you think you know how this story ends, the truth takes a turn. How far can someone go to protect their secrets? If you're enjoying this documentary, subscribe to this channel to stay connected and updated. The day Mark Williams was arrested, the atmosphere in the neighborhood was thick with tension. The streets of East Flamingo Road had always been quiet, a place where the hum of everyday life could be heard clearly, but now there was an undeniable shift. The murmurs of disbelief and whispers of shock reverberated through the neighborhood. People who had once waved at Mark as he passed by in his patrol car now found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about him. The officer who had spent years enforcing the law, upholding the very ideals of justice, was now the very definition of betrayal. News of the arrest spread quickly. It seemed like every resident in the area had something to say about it. The contrast between Mark's image as a dedicated officer and the heinous crime he had committed left many grappling with the truth. Was this truly the man they had trusted? How could someone who had pledged to protect and serve turn so violently against a young woman? For some, the news was almost too much to bear. For others, it was a sobering revelation that shattered their view of law enforcement. As Mark sat in a holding cell, the weight of his actions began to settle in. His initial bravado had waned, replaced by a quiet panic that gnawed at his insides. The confession he had given to the detective had not been easy, but it had been his only way to ease the mounting pressure. He had not expected it to be so difficult to come to terms with the reality of his own actions. Yet, the more he thought about the day of Sarah's death, the more he realized how far he had crossed a line he couldn't undo. What had started as a series of small decisions had culminated in an irreversible tragedy. The power he had felt, the control he had believed he wielded, had been his undoing. Mark had convinced himself that his position gave him authority over Sarah, that she was just another person to dominate. But in his blind quest for dominance, he had overlooked one simple fact. She was a person. She had hopes, dreams, and a life outside of him. His need for power had erased that from his mind. In that moment of rage, he hadn't seen her as the young woman trying to break free from his grip. He had only seen a figure he needed to destroy to preserve his fragile sense of control. As the days passed, Mark's legal team scrambled to mount a defense. They tried to argue that his actions had been the result of a psychological breakdown, pointing to his years on the force as a contributing factor to his deteriorating mental state. The stresses of the job, they claimed, had finally taken their toll. It wasn't hard to see the desperation in their arguments. They were clutching at straws, hoping that some shred of doubt could be cast on the cold, hard facts of the case. But for the community and for Sarah's family, the truth was clear. Mark had crossed a line that no amount of legal maneuvering could erase. In the weeks that followed, the media coverage of the case reached a fever pitch. The nation watched as the trial unfolded, each new revelation adding to the growing sense of outrage. Mark's behavior, once hidden behind a badge, was now exposed for the world to see. His racist views, his manipulative tendencies, and his propensity for violence were all laid bare. But perhaps the most damning aspect of the case was the realization that Sarah had tried to escape his grasp in the days leading up to her death. She had reached out to friends, telling them she was scared, telling them she felt trapped. Those closest to her now wondered if they could have done more to intervene, to help her break free from the toxic grip Mark had on her life. Sarah's family struggled to find peace amidst the turmoil. Her mother, who had always believed in her daughter's resilience, now found herself questioning every choice Sarah had made in the months before her death. The guilt weighed heavily on her. Could she have done something to save Sarah from Mark's wrath? The pain of losing her daughter was compounded by the fact that she had been unable to protect her from the danger that had lurked just around the corner. As the trial approached its climax, Mark's fate seemed inevitable. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His confession, the testimonies of witnesses who had seen the changes in his behavior, the texts he had sent Sarah in the days leading up to her death, all pointed to one undeniable truth. Mark Williams was guilty of murder, and the community would have to reckon with the consequences of his actions. But for Sarah's family, there was no sense of closure. The trial may have been the end of Mark's journey, but it was only the beginning of a long road for those who had been left behind. The loss of a loved one at the hands of someone they had trusted, someone who was supposed to protect, left scars that would never fully heal. No amount of justice, no matter how swift or final, could bring Sarah back. It happens, and sometimes you can't control it. Seeing her father in prison left Sarah without purpose, and as the trial came to a close, with Mark being found guilty of second-degree murder, Sarah's family could only hold on to the fragments of their memories of her. A life stolen too soon by the very person who had sworn to protect them all. In the end, Mark was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, a consequence that, while just, could never undo the damage he had caused. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, facing the consequences of his actions. But as Sarah's family mourned, they realized that no amount of justice would ever be enough. The pain of losing Sarah, the fact that she had been taken from them so violently, would remain with them forever. As the years went by, the case of Mark Williams would become a cautionary tale, a reminder of how unchecked power and racism can fester in the most unexpected places. It would serve as a stark example of how someone, even with a badge and a position of authority, could be consumed by their darkest impulses. And for the residents of East Flamingo Road, life would never be the same again. The small, quiet neighborhood where they had once trusted in the men and women who protected them had been forever changed by one man's reckless, violent behavior. The name Mark Williams would linger in their memories for years to come, a reminder of how fragile the line between justice and corruption truly is. And for Sarah's family, the pain of her loss would never truly fade. It would be a constant ache, a wound that time could never heal. The impact of Sarah's death rippled through the community in ways no one could have anticipated. It was not just the shock of losing someone so young, so full of potential. It was the betrayal that cut deepest. The betrayal of trust, not only in Mark Williams as a figure of authority, but in the very institutions meant to protect them all. Mark, who had patrolled the streets and ensured the safety of the neighborhood, was now seen as a predator in their midst. Someone who had taken advantage of his position and used it to exploit a vulnerable young woman. The revelations about his affair with Sarah and the shocking violence that had followed sent waves of distrust through the community. Neighbors who had once been friendly with Mark now found themselves looking over their shoulders. They had all known him, perhaps waved when he drove past or greeted him in passing. They had never once suspected the darkness lurking beneath his exterior. Now, they couldn't help but wonder how many other officers in the department harbored similar secrets. How many others had taken advantage of their power, using it to manipulate and control. The trust that had once bound the community together now seemed fragile, threadbare, unraveling with every new revelation. Mark's conviction had sent a clear message. The justice system had acted swiftly. But that sense of justice didn't bring solace to the community, nor did it heal the wounds Sarah's family had suffered. The verdict had been delivered, but it felt hollow, inadequate. Sarah's mother, once a woman full of optimism, was now a shadow of her former self. She had lost her daughter, and felt as though a part of her own soul had been ripped away. Every day was a painful reminder that the person she had raised, the girl who had so much potential, was gone, her life stolen from her by the very hands meant to protect. For Sarah's father, the heartbreak was compounded by guilt. He hadn't been there when she needed him most. As a father, he had always believed that his role was to provide for his family, to give them a stable and secure life. But now, in the silence of his grief, he wondered if he had failed her. Had he not seen the signs? Had he not been vigilant enough? The questions gnawed at him, threatening to consume him whole. The loss of his daughter, coupled with the failure he felt, became an unbearable burden. The guilt extended beyond the immediate family. Friends of Sarah, people who had known her since childhood, were also left questioning their actions. Could they have done something to intervene? Sarah had been open with her friends about the way she felt trapped in her relationship with Mark. She had confided in them, spoken about the tension she felt, the fear that had begun to take root in her heart. Yet, none of them had been able to offer the help she needed in time. The weight of that failure was something none of them could shake. As the months passed, Sarah's story became a symbol of something greater. It wasn't just the tale of a young woman whose life had been stolen. It was the story of power gone unchecked, of a community's misplaced trust, and of a system that had failed to protect one of its most vulnerable members. The media coverage, which had initially focused on the sensational details of the case, soon turned into broader conversations about the state of law enforcement and the abuse of power within the system. Advocacy groups began to organize protests, calling for reform, demanding more accountability from those who wore the badge and carried the weight of authority. The case became a rallying cry for those who believed that change was necessary within the criminal justice system. The brutality of Mark's actions, the way he had manipulated his position and preyed upon Sarah, was a stark reminder that authority could be abused, that those in power were not always the protectors they claimed to be. The incident served as a wake-up call, not only for the people of Las Vegas, but for the entire country. It ignited a much-needed conversation about the need for oversight, for reforms in how officers interacted with those they swore to serve. In the aftermath of the trial, as Mark was taken to prison, the neighborhood slowly began to rebuild, but the scars left behind would not fade easily. Sarah's friends and family found themselves facing a new kind of normal, one where the memories of her death haunted them like a ghost, always just beneath the surface. There was no going back to the way things had been before Mark's arrest. Life as they had known it had been irreversibly altered. Mark, now behind bars, spent his days reflecting on the choices that had led him here. He had been a man who once believed in the system, who had worn his badge with pride. But as he sat in his cell, the reality of his situation began to sink in. He was no longer the lawman, the protector of the peace. He was a man condemned by his own actions. He could no longer escape the truth that he had not only destroyed a young woman's life, but had also shattered his own. The affair, the lies, the violence, all of it had led to this moment, and there was no undoing it. For the rest of his life, Mark would be defined by his crime. There would be no redemption, no opportunity to fix the wrongs he had done. The love he had once felt for Sarah, if it could even be called love, had only ever been a delusion, a twisted need to dominate, to exert power. There had been no affection, no care, only a deep-seated belief that she was something to possess, a thing to be controlled. And in his desire for control, he had destroyed everything that mattered, including his own life. As the years went on, the story of Sarah's death would continue to haunt the residents of East Flamingo Road. It would be a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, of the importance of vigilance, and of the necessity of protecting the most vulnerable. It was a tragedy that would never be forgotten, a scar on the fabric of the community that would remain long after the trial ended, and the headlines faded away. And for Sarah's family, the pain of her loss would never truly end. It would be something they carried with them, a constant presence that shaped their lives. The justice they had fought for, the conviction they had secured, would never be enough to bring her back. But they had done everything they could. They had not let her story fade into the background. They had fought for her, and in doing so, they ensured that her memory would live on. Sarah's legacy was one of strength, of resilience, and of the harsh reality that sometimes justice comes too late. Justice was served, but was it enough? Would you have seen the warning signs before it was too late? If you love interesting true crime stories like this, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next shocking case.